think it's a good time to start. So welcome everyone to another in our WEFI Lecture Series. I think we've got a few left. We're excited to have David here to present some thoughts on behavioral economics and entrepreneurship. Let me introduce David. I think everyone knows him, but you gotta get this formal intro out of the way. So David is the James and Gail van der Vade Professor of Finance at Duke, along with important service to the field, co-organizing MBR Entrepreneurship Working Group, managing the invaluable Entrepreneurship Bootcamp. Reminder, application deadline is the 26th. I put it in the chat. And co-organizing WEFI with Yael, Song, and myself. David has made major contributions to several fields in finance and economics. So these include mergers and acquisitions, private equity, entrepreneurial finance, financial literacy, and discrimination. I'm probably missing one, David, I'm sorry. Most relevant for today's talk, David has really important work on the intersection of behavioral economics and entrepreneurship. I know that everyone is as excited as I am to learn more about this area from David's lecture. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor off to David, and he's going to provide the logistics on how he wants to handle today's interaction. So thanks again, David.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, gracious introduction. I'm really happy to be here. It's really been fun organizing this WEFI seminar series and lecture series with you, Mike, and appreciate you letting me be a part of it. In terms of just ground rules, logistics, what I'm going to do is talk for maybe, I don't know, I don't really have a clear sense of how long this will take, maybe an hour, maybe a little less. I'm not going to dive into really nitty-gritty details on any papers. I'm just going to try to provide kind of a framework or a way of thinking about things. And so, first of all, I'll apologize in advance to anyone whose work I skip over. Please don't take offense to it. It's just, these are just kind of, this is sort of just a loose framework for thinking about things. There's a lot of work out there that I have not managed to cite here. And then if you have questions, comments, and they can be of a clarifying nature, or if you just want, or not, please just speak up at any point. I'm not super good at managing the chat window, but I trust that Mike will jump in and help me out if questions come up there. And also I can take some time at the end after we finish the slides to kind of just talk more generally with anyone who has questions. So I've titled this lecture, as it were, Behavioral Economics and Entrepreneurial Action. And so I guess what I consider to be the central question is, what I consider to be the central question that I want to focus on today is, can insights from behavioral economics help us to understand why it is the case that some people choose to be entrepreneurs and other people don't? Before I go any further, let me just say that understanding this broader question, why do some people choose to be entrepreneurs while other people don't, that's a fundamental question in entrepreneurship research, and it can be attacked from a number of different angles. And I know people just looking through the participant list, I know many of you have addressed elements of this question in your own research. I'm going to specifically focus just on kind of understanding how insights from behavioral economics can help us. And I'm going to ignore a lot of things to do with how financial market constraints, other kinds of impediments, racial bias, gender bias, those kind of factors might also be play a role in helping understand why some people choose to be entrepreneurs and others don't. But to kind of put this question in context, there's a common narrative going back really, I guess, in some ways to Hamilton's JPE paper, a common narrative that basically argues that a lot of entrepreneurs would be better off if they weren't entrepreneurs. In other words, it seems like entrepreneurship doesn't really pay in some sense. And so, Hamilton's JPE paper shows that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Moskowitz and Vizen-Jorgensen have evidence on the sort of the returns to owning private businesses, suggesting that they are low and people would be much better off if they were better diversified. So that gives you some evidence that people who engage in self-employment aren't getting the remuneration that they could if they chose a different path in life. And then you take that and you couple it with papers like Camera and Lavallo, which provide a framework and experimental evidence for why we might see excessive entry. And you pretty quickly can kind of build a behavioral story that says that behavioral factors cause people to over-enter into entrepreneurship. Now, having said that, there is this obvious tension between that perspective and the perspective taken by many policymakers who tout entrepreneurship as this key mechanism by which we promote economic growth. And also, there's been a lot of work recently, some of which is focused on understanding the dynamics of the wealth distribution over time, that stresses the role of entrepreneurship and private business ownership in explaining why the right tail of the in wealth distribution looks like it does. So there is an important tension there that I don't want to overlook. But nevertheless, what we want to ask today is, why do people enter self-employment? Why do people stay in self-employment? And in some sense, do the right people enter self-employment? In other words, are there people who are choosing not to enter self-employment who might be better off if they were entrepreneurs? And are the people who are entering self-employment, are they sort of maximizing lifetime utility in some vague sense? I think it's important to acknowledge there's work that's come from a number of different perspectives that has sort of, I would say, cast doubt on the robustness of this idea that there is an entrepreneurship penalty. And a lot of these have cited two here, but there are others. There are papers that, I think in broad terms, what they do is they stress the importance of understanding the compositional factors in cross-section or entrepreneurial samples. In other words, some samples of entrepreneurs appear to demonstrate low returns to entrepreneurship or whatever, but it's important to control for how long the people have been entrepreneurs and what path they're coming into entrepreneurship from. Are they coming out of unemployment, or are they leaving paid employment? And I think the stylized fact that there's an entrepreneurship penalty, it has a lot of caveats associated with it, most of which I will not be able to go into today. I also want to say that a completely separate and I think very interesting question, which I will not discuss today, is how do the same kind of behavioral factors that we're going to talk about today impact not the demand side of entrepreneurial capital, but the supply side of entrepreneurial capital? In other words, do VCs, do angels, do accelerators, do people who are making decisions about allocating providing capital to entrepreneurs, do they suffer from some of the same behavioral biases that we've seen elsewhere in the literature? And if so, how does that impact the new business formation? I think that's a very promising area where we're starting to see some work. And I imagine we'll see a lot more interesting work with more data out there. I'll just give a quick shout out to a recent paper that was brought to my attention by Gary Dushnitsky and Sarkar, where they look at people graduating from accelerators. And when I say graduating, I'm saying they're looking at the weather on the pitch day. Most accelerators have a pitch day. And they have a result in their paper that's very similar to this old result by Hirschleifer and Shumway about the weather affecting people's stock purchase behavior. What they see is that if you graduate on a sunnier pitch day, you have an easier time raising funding as an entrepreneur. In other words, the funders seem to be more generous when it's sunnier outside, which is a statement about affect affecting people's decision making. The sunny weather puts people in a better mood. The better mood alters their decision making context. And that illustrates a classic principle in behavioral economics, or sort of a classic underlying belief in a lot of behavioral economics research, which is that by manipulating the sort of the narrow framing of the decision context, you can generate reliable biases in individual behavior. Okay, so that's all just a long-winded way of kind of introducing the material and kind of grounding it in the broader literature. Let me just jump in. So entrepreneurs are everywhere. If you look at the distribution of firm size in the U.S. economy. There are about 30 million businesses in the U.S. economy. About 25 million of them are solo operators. About 20,000 of them have more than 500 firms. And so, the vast majority of business organizations in the US are in some sense entrepreneurial. And yet so few of them can put a man in space and bring the rocket back to land on the pad so it can be reused. In other words, there's this enormous ocean of self-employed individuals, most of whom don't even employ another person to work with them. And then out of that broad set, there appear to be a very, very few number of individuals who embrace, radical innovation that kind of transforms the economy. When you look at people's entrepreneurial intentions, I think there are some interesting things we can learn. So Victor Bennett and Ronnie Chatterjee, my colleagues at Duke in the strategy area, have a paper in SMJ where they asked, they had basically a census weighted random sample of Americans, and they did this over Qualtrics. They asked, have you had an idea for a business in the last 5 years? And what you can see is that of the people who considered starting a business, very few people take meaningful steps towards actually starting the business. So, around 60% of them discuss an idea with a friend or a work colleague. Less than half, around 30%, for example, reach out to someone who they don't know in order to try to get feedback about whether the business idea works. Fewer still, build a website, create some sort of business plan, summary, something like that. So there's a lot of scope for self-assessment and assessments of the probability of success or failure to help to determine whether you take these steps that lead towards starting a business. And so you can see if you have misperceptions of the returns to starting a business, you may do this too much, or you may do this not enough. Here's a paper by De Gennaro and Dwyer where they did a survey of angel investors. And what you can see is that by far the most common result in angel investing is to lose everything. And in fact, only a small handful of investments make, substantial returns that would be commensurate with the kind of risk you're taking here. So investing in entrepreneurs doesn't seem to pay. Investing in early stage entrepreneurs doesn't seem to pay very well on average. I have some work with Katja Kisileva and Axel Muse. We are looking at using Norwegian administrative data to look at the returns to investing in private companies. Is another way to take a look at sort of like, what are the returns to being an entrepreneur? We'll look at the returns to investing in entrepreneurs. And, I don't want to dwell on these performance statistics, but basically a vast majority or a very large fraction of investments are complete losses. And the bulk of the returns that are being earned on average are earned by just a tiny sliver of investments that generate enormous returns. Most investments don't do very well. You can look in the Kaufman Firm survey where you see that around half of the initial sample that they formed in 2000. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Kaufman Firm survey is a what is that, an 8 or 9 year panel of firms that were first sampled in 2004 and followed through 2011. And you can see of the roughly 4,200 firms that were sampled in 2004, better than half of them have failed by the end of the survey. And here, if you can look, this is results from Moskowitz and Vissing-Jorgensen in their AER paper. The highlighted numbers, which hopefully you can see, show different measures of returns to private business ownership. And then by comparison, over the same period of time, you can see the returns to investing in the CRISP valuated index. So basically, that's just a proxy for if you had held a well-diversified, valuated market portfolio. And what you can see is that the returns are generally lower than what you would have gotten by investing in the market, and the market provides much lower volatility than you would face if you were owning private business. So, and they have more evidence there. This is a Hamilton JPE paper where he shows that earnings to entrepreneurship are below what you would expect to get in wage employment for someone of similar skill and tenure. And so, you look at this vast array of evidence that's coming from a number of different angles there. You can look at it from the investor's perspective and say, what are the returns to investing in entrepreneurs? You can look at it from the entrepreneur's perspective and say, what are my business failure rates look like? What are the private returns to me as an entrepreneur from investing? And it looks like you'd have to be crazy to start a business. And so why do people do it? And I guess this is going back to this very common narrative that I started with. This is sort of the narrative that kick-started a lot of research trying to understand the behavioral foundations of entrepreneurial entry. Was work starting with Hamilton and moving forward from there, showing that people didn't seem to do very well as entrepreneurs on average. And so why do people start businesses? Well, there are a number of reasons. One might be optimism. And so what do I mean by optimism? What I mean is having a subjective probability distribution over future states of the world that differs from what the objective probability distribution, or what a historically informed probability distribution would look like. And so this could result from errors in judgment or mistaken beliefs, but it could also attach to or arise from personality differences. And these personality differences could be biological in nature, or they could also be attributable to things like personal background and parental exposures. And so an interesting paper in this regard is Libby Mishkin's job market paper in 2017. We're talking about background and parental exposure, where she shows that if girls who do not have brothers but who have fathers who are entrepreneurs, those girls are much more likely to become entrepreneurs themselves than if they have a brother, which is to suggest that there's a lot of parental imprinting and sharing of knowledge and things like that get passed on to the brother in a household where you have siblings of both genders, but get passed on exclusively to the daughter if she's an only child. That's an example of the presence of parental exposure being important. So you could think that optimism arises from that, either from errors in judgment that are arising from the way the decision environment is being framed, or from more long-lasting sort of personality fixed effects that might be arising from biology, but also might be arising from training and background. That's one possibility. Another possibility is overconfidence. And I think in the literature, there's a fair degree of overlap and some confusion around the difference between with overconfidence and optimism. In other words, I think about overconfidence in relation to optimism as being about the second moment of the distribution versus the first moment. In other words, I think of an overconfident individual as someone who's posteriors are too tight relative to what they know about the set of future outcomes. So an optimist has a bias in their mean. An overconfident person has a standard deviation that's too narrow. Either of these could lead to excessive entrepreneurial entry. The first would make you think that the idea is better than it might actually be. The second would lead you to think that there's less uncertainty associated with it, and so there's less value in waiting. Just go ahead and do it. Then a third reason why you might think people start businesses is that they have preferences for skewness, that they have some utility from effort, or from being their own boss, or that there's a lot of cross-sectional variation in risk tolerance. And so people who are more willing to take risk start businesses. That's a model where entrepreneurs are rational, but they just have sort of non-standard preferences, and they're maximizing utility subject to these non-standard preferences, and they're entering entrepreneurship. So what I want to do is talk a little bit, part 3 is very hard to distinguish. It's very hard to sort of categorically rule out 3 in favor of 1 or 2, but let me kind of walk through these in some detail. So how should we think about these things like optimism over confidence? There's sort of 2 competing perspectives that you can bring to bear on this. One is what I would call sort of the classic behavioral economics perspective, which has its origins in the work of Kahneman and Tversky, showing that cognitive heuristics and systematic misunderstandings of chance, the way probabilities work, lead to predictable biases in judgment. And if you take this view of the origins of these misperceptions, then you pretty quickly conclude that most people would be better off if they didn't enter entrepreneurship, because a message here is that most people would be better off if they could correct these cognitive heuristics. Now, in this regard, there's a set of papers by David DeMisa and co-authors. I know Simon Parker has a number of papers arguing that too much entrepreneurship occurs, and that this is that mistaken beliefs drive excessive entry into entrepreneurship. And so you can think about those papers as almost being entrepreneurship specific manifestations of the Kammerer and Lavallo paper I was mentioning earlier, which takes place in an experimental setting. So I know, for example, David DeMisa in some of his papers uses British survey data where they survey people's expectations before leaving paid employment, and disproportionately it's people who have sort of positively miscalibrated about future payoffs before they start the business are those who leave paid employment to start businesses. So there's certainly evidence that mistaken beliefs drive entrepreneurial entry. There's also a literature that can be sometimes called personality psychology. The Kahneman and Tversky stuff, the way I look at it at least, is that it points out that we have these biases, these systematic misunderstandings, and we would all be better off if we could get rid of them. If we could just be more rational, we would be happier. Personality psychology takes a slightly different point of view. And there's a classic paper by Taylor and Brown called Illusion and Well-Being, a Social Psychological Perspective on Mental Health, where they point out that mentally healthy people display unrealistically positive self-assessments. They display they suffer from what is called the illusion of control. They think that they have control over things that are in fact outside of their control, and they have overly rosy views of the future. So in other words, being massively miscalibrated and thinking things are going to turn out better than they likely will seems to be part and parcel of just good mental health. I think many of you have probably heard that. It's now sort of almost like an anecdote. I forget the origin of the result, and it may in fact be Taylor and Brown, that only the clinically depressed are sort of have accurate expectations about the future. We have to have a certain amount of illusion just to sort of get out of bed in the morning. Likewise, there's a very influential paper by Weinstein called Unrealistic Optimism About Future Life Events. And he shows that people systematically believe good things are going to happen to them in the future. In fact, Weinstein has developed well, anyway, let me move on. So these are kind of two competing perspectives on how we might think about behavioral biases entering our decision-making process. The first is that it's bad. The second is that it's natural. And so we might in some ways, it's hard to run it. It's not that we're going to reject one theory in favor of the other, because both theories are going to say that people who are, people who hold the most optimistic views, people who think that they can influence outcomes more than they can, are going to be the ones who start businesses. So both theories sort of make those predictions. It's really more just a question of what's the source of the underlying variation that's driving that. So let me talk a little bit about the second piece. Where do we get our traits? So there's a series of papers by Jim Heckman and his co-authors, which illustrate the importance of non-cognitive skills for life achievement. And so, what he shows is that a variety of traits that are largely fixed by the time early adolescence occurs have strong predictive power for later adult life outcomes, like how much your wages as an adult. And so that suggests that a lot of things that are happening early in life are important for shaping the traits that people take with them in life when they make decisions across a wide variety of contexts. Related to that, there is a lot of evidence that that parental transmission of human capital is very important for entrepreneurial entry. So there's a famous paper by Dunn and Holtz-Eakin, which shows that basically it's one of the first papers in economics to show that the children of entrepreneurs are much more likely to themselves become entrepreneurs than randomly selected individuals. So Dunn and Holtz-Eakin frame that result in the context of the transmission of financial capital versus the transmission of human capital. And their result is that, well, it's the parental transmission of human capital, which is some amalgamation of the business know-how and sort of helping people understand that they might have preferences towards entrepreneurship, that is important, that is more important than the transmission of financial capital across generations in affecting whether someone becomes an entrepreneur. Fairley and Robb have some similar findings. There are papers in sociology that that illustrate this result. It's got a name in sociology. I guess it's called the life course theory in sociology. In any case, this is in some sense related to the managerial fixed effects literature in economics. So Bertrand and Shore have a famous paper about managerial style affecting corporate decisions. Graham, Harvey, and Puri have a paper showing that CEOs and CFOs exhibit optimistic personalities. And Steve Kaplan and Morton Sorensen have a series of papers using personality tests from headhunters. And they show that the personality traits among startup founders are systematically different from other types of individuals. So I guess what I'm saying is, an important question for research in economics as it relates to entrepreneurship is understanding the origins of psychological differences that you might think really amount to being differences in traits rather than differences in narrow decision frames. One approach to this is what you might call the biological perspective. And if one way to think about the origins of traits, or to think about how much of it is coming from, or I guess let me back up. One way to think about the Dunn and Holt-Eakin result when you're thinking about the parental transmission of human capital. Think about what's being transmitted from a parent to a child. You're transmitting your genes, you're transmitting your behaviors, and you're transmitting things like coaching and advice. And so, you introduce a child to a musical instrument and they learn to like the musical instrument. Well, the same thing could be happening with entrepreneurship. You introduce the child to entrepreneurship and they learn that they like it. So how do we think about sort of like how much of the overall package of human capital transmission from one generation to the next belongs to each of these buckets? Well, one thing that's important to recognize is some of it could be just purely biological. There's an interesting paper by Nicolau, Shane, Cherkis, Hunkin, and Spector in 2008, which basically tries to observe the genetic foundations of entrepreneurship. And they use what's in epidemia, they use what's called the ACE model, the ACE model. ACE stands for, if I'm not mistaken, additive, common, and environmental. The E is like the unique environmental, the C is the common environmental, and the A is the additive individual part. So basically, they look at twins, and the difference between identical twins and fraternal twins. So fraternal twins are no more genetically similar than regular brother and sister, so they share sort of half their genetic code, whereas identical twins are more or less exact genetic copies of one another. So they can look at the variance in outcomes and things like entrepreneurship across twins, and look at the group of identical twins and look at the group of fraternal twins, and basically look at the difference in the correlations across the two groups gives you a measure of the genetic component to entrepreneurship. And so they have a sample of about 2,500 British twins. Now, an important caveat here is that about 90% of these twins were women. And that's important because we know that female entrepreneurship rates are much lower than male entrepreneurship rates. So that you might want to put an asterisk there. But looking at that set of 2,500 British twins, they find that about half of the variation it owes to genetic factors, and the remaining half is sort of unique environmental factors. There's a nice summary of this biological perspective in a recent paper by Nicolau, Fan, and Stefan that I'll point you to if you have more interest in the subject. Again, talking about traits and sort of the origins of individual differences in the proclivity to become entrepreneurs, Rob Fairley has a nice paper from the late 90s looking at the prevalence of crime, among criminal activity among those who later become entrepreneurs. So he uses the 1980 NLSY, which had a panel on drug use. And basically what he's asking is, how does dealing drugs as a youth relate to entering into entrepreneurship later in life. And so he defines being a drug dealer, in quotes, is someone who says that more than 5 times in over that survey window, they sold hard or soft drugs. And so that's his measure of being a drug dealer. And then he looks at self-employment in the 1981 through 1996 sort of follow-up interval in the NLSY. And what he finds is that if you're a drug dealer, you're about 15% more likely to be self-employed. Now, you might think that that's coming from the fact that if you're dealing drugs, you've kind of put yourself on the margins of society, and maybe self-employment is the only source of employment that you can find because you're not really cut out for regular work. He finds very little explanatory power comes from having been incarcerated or continuing to be a drug dealer as a source of self-employment. Instead, and also he finds that this result is much weaker among people who are drug dealers, but also drug users. So instead, it's evidence that some kind of combination of latent preferences towards autonomy associated with self-employment and a willingness to take risk demonstrated early in life show up in much later age entrepreneurial choices. Let me pause there for a second and just maybe see if there are any questions. I know a few things have come through the chat window.
Yeah. So Avery had a couple questions, I think, about the difference between optimist and pessimist, where a pessimist has much more information, for example.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
That tells you.
Don't know Avery's sense of humor.
I did mention the Rod Chetty studies, which
Yeah.
what you said in terms of looking at zip codes where people there's a lot of innovation. People were more likely to grow up to be innovators. So I pointed this study out, which I'm sure you know.
Yeah, I think that's an important story. There's also some interesting work by him and others on looking at kindergartens, and that I guess your point is well taken, and there is a large body of work that talks about kind of environmental factors in one's youth having a broad impact over the whole range of later life course outcomes, and entrepreneurship is just a narrow slice of that. 100% agree with you on that. Well, let me continue. I want to quickly talk about a paper I did with Manju Puri a number of years ago, because we were aware of these other papers, and we thought it was fascinating that you could see evidence of latent preferences toward risk taking and autonomy and things like that, and having an impact on self-employment. But we wanted to try to understand whether we could get like large nationally representative data that would allow us to say something about optimism and the role that it might have in self-employment. And so we turned to the Survey of Consumer Finances, in part because it's a wonderful survey in terms of what a detailed picture it paints of the households' spending and earning patterns. The Survey of Consumer Finance does not have, and you also know, you know whether someone has a business, and you also know, for example, how many businesses they have. You have a lot of information about how much income they derive from businesses relative to other sources of income that they have. The Survey of Consumer Finances is an important part of the Moskowitz and Vissing-Jurgensen paper. So that was kind of why we were interested in starting there and seeing what we could glean from it in terms of a measure of optimism. The survey does not ask how optimistic are you, and I'm not sure you would want to use that question if they did, but they do ask the question about how long do you expect to live. And we thought to ourselves, well, why don't we try and see if you can get any mileage out of the answer to that question as a measure of optimism? Because we knew we had demographics, we had detailed demographics from the SCF. It also asked things like whether you're a smoker. So we could take all that information and then and go to what are called life tables. And so life tables are what actuaries use to compute statistical life expectancies. And so we basically just constructed a measure of optimism that was the difference between someone's subjective life expectancy and what you would get out of a life table. And it turns out, it turns out that we didn't know if this would work in it, but it turns out it works pretty well. So, you know, the average female in the survey of consumer finances is around 50 years old, thinks they're going to live to 82.7. They're actually going to live to 82.1. Males are a little bit younger in the survey. They think they're going to live longer than they're you know, they think they're going to live to be about 82. In fact, they're going to live to about 78 and a half. And once you correct for smoking and other demographics, they display about 2 years of optimism, whereas the females are on balance about right. So there are a lot of concerns with this measure. You might think that some people are prone to giving capricious answers. There could be data problems that polluted the measure. Answers tend to end in 5s or 0s. Very few people say I'm going to live to 79. They say they're going to live to 80, for example. Also, saying that you're going to be exactly 100, that's a fairly common response. So we were careful going through the data by hand to make sure that we couldn't find clear evidence of people misinterpreting the question or providing flippant answers. We also created an extreme optimism category, which is you think you're going to live to 100. But we found pretty clear evidence that this correlates with beliefs about the economy and about other things. So the economy will improve, stay the same, or get worse. You can see like the difference between improve and get worse has a T statistic of 6 associated with it. Unexplained optimism is just optimism regressed on observable demographics, and you get the same basic story. So we had this measure, and it seems to correlate with other measures of more narrow economic optimism. And so we wanted to use that measure and see if we could document that optimists behave differently than pessimists across a range of economic activities. We found that they were more likely to be self-employed, that they worked longer hours per week, that they were more likely to report that they were never going to retire, and they really thought that they would expected to postpone retirement. We even found that, like, so I guess this is the triumph of hope over, I forget the expression, the triumph of hope over reality or whatever, but conditional on divorce, optimists are more likely to be remarried. So there's a wide range of behaviors that optimists do differently than pessimists. Now, a few slides ago, I was saying that there's this tension in this psychology literature between sort of the Kahneman-Tversky school, which says that people would be better off if they could correct these biases, and the personality psychology school that says that, no, this is part of positive mental health. Are the behaviors that we're seeing good or bad? We tried to look in the data to see. So first of all, we set aside extreme optimists from regular optimists. And what we found is that extreme optimists were more likely to be smokers. They worked less. They hoped to retire sooner. They didn't save as much. Whereas the sort of moderate optimists that we found in the data, people who are not reporting that they're going to live to be exactly 100, but people who are just displaying a little bit of positive bias in their life expectancy. Those are the ones who save more, smoke less, work more, think they're going to retire later, and are more likely to become entrepreneurs. So we took that measure and we found that entrepreneurs, or in other words, self-employed individuals, are more optimistic than demographically similar wage earners. We found a lot of people think about that and think that entrepreneurs are risk takers. We found sort of nuanced evidence of entrepreneurship and risk taking. It seems like people, entrepreneurs are not, for example, less likely to be insured, things like that. They take risk, but they do so prudently. They seem to derive substantial private benefits from self-employment. And we proxied that by never intending to retire. So let me just quickly show you these things. So never retire is our measure of deriving non-pecuniary benefits from self-employment. Loves risk is a variable so there's a variable in the survey of consumer finances that says, I am willing to take X risk for X return. And you choose among a Likert scale. X can be, substantial risk for substantial return, moderate risk for moderate return, and so on. So we said you were a risk lover if you were willing to take substantial risk for substantial return. And that's a dummy variable. And then there's our optimism measure. And so you can see that each of these measures predicts self-employment by itself, and optimism and non-pecuniary benefits of self-employment stand up in a regression where you've sort of got them all running against each other. We can distinguish in the survey of consumer finances between people who bought or started a business versus people who inherited a business from their family. And what you can see is that the results around optimism and risk loving are much weaker in that sample. So really, that's, I guess, about all I have. I just wanted to kind of provide a high level overview here. Most businesses fail. Everybody seems to recognize that this is true sort of on average. And in spite of that, we seem to promote people to become entrepreneurs. And so what I've tried to do very briefly today is to give a high level overview of some papers in the entrepreneurship literature that help us understand what personality factors or decision-making factors cause people to keep starting business, keep running them, and how these self-perceptions impact their entrepreneurial entry. So I think in broad terms, there's sort of three sets of behavioral motivations for starting a business: preferences for skewness, utility from the deriving utility from being self-employed. In other words, just enjoying being your own boss, having a high degree of risk tolerance, but these things taking place in a rational expectations framework, in a sense. That's one perspective you can take. Another perspective you can take is that there are fixed, latent, individual level differences in subjective probability distributions that make entrepreneurship more attractive for some people than for others. And here I would say the jury is very much out about when we see an adult enter self-employment, where were those traits formed? Were they formed in the womb, early in life, or later in life? I think the jury is very much out there. And I think that's an important question, because when you think about sort of designing entrepreneurial training programs, things like that, a basic question, a very basic question in that literature would be like, what are the returns to exposing young people to self-employment, showing young people how to start their own business? Would that help the right types of people find self-employment as a meaningful vocation in life? Well, I think your views on whether that's a good idea or a bad idea very much hinge on the model that you think is at work for how these individual differences are formed. If you take kind of the Heckman approach and say, well, factors that are happening early in a person's life, cause them to have a set of more or less fixed traits that they take with them from adolescence onward, well, then that might be less effective than if you have a model where people's trait formation is still malleable well until their young adulthood. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done there. The third approach you can take here is just that this isn't necessarily driven by individual differences per se. It's just driven by errors in judgment and misperceptions of chance that have to do with contextual factors. And if that's the point of view you have, then the systematic decision biases are probably things that you would like to correct when you think about giving people sort of advice about entrepreneurship. I also think that going forward, an important area for future research is understanding how these same factors affect the provision of capital on the supply side, especially in connection to longstanding issues surrounding equity and access.